Hi, this is Dalene with McDonald's Sewing and Vacuum, and today I want to talk to you about stabilizers for machine embroidery. This is one of the things that I think confuses people the most when they start with machine embroidery, is knowing what stabilizer to use for what situation. So I'm just going to show you the ones that I use the most and explain to you how I use them, and then follow up maybe with another video later on some specialty stabilizers. So this one's just the basics. It's also just what I've learned from trial and error and what my preferences are. It does become at a certain point a personal preference about what you use. So I'm just going to share with you what I do. I would suggest you try it. And if you like it, great, and if not, keep looking. I'm sure there are a lot of information out there about this, but I had a customer ask me to do a video, so we're going to do that today. So the first thing I recommend that you start with if you're brand new to machine embroidery is just a plain medium weight cutaway. And there are lots of different brands out there. I'm not really going to talk about the brand today, but this is a Cutaway Stabilizer. It's almost cloth-like in feel. It's pretty heavy, and the reason I suggest this for beginners is that it's going to provide you with some good stabilization. So even if you've got lots of satin stitches, like on my apron here, that's called a satin stitch or heavy stitching, you're usually going to do pretty well with a Cutaway Stabilizer. And just like the name implies, you stitch on it, and then when you're done with your embroidery, you go to the back side of your work and you trim it away. So if you just want one stabilizer to start with, I would just recommend a regular Cutaway Stabilizer. So I always have some of that on hand. Another one that I recommend that you always have on hand is a medium tearaway. And a tearaway, again, it's a little more convenient. This one has kind of a papery feel. Some of them, like this one, this is also a tearaway, but it's a little softer. It feels, again, a little bit more like the cutaway, like a cloth. But when you're finished stitching, instead of cutting it away with scissors, you can actually pull it away carefully from your stitches. So the tearaway, just because it is a tearaway and it's designed for you to tear easily, isn't going to give you as much stabilization as a cutaway. So I use this for kind of average stitch count. So when I'm trying to decide what stabilizer to use, there are a few things I have to take into consideration. One is the type of stitch you're going to do, type of design you're going to do. If it's a design with a lot of stitching in it, lots of heavy stitching or lots of satin stitches or just really dense embroidery, then you're going to want a heavier stabilizer. If it's a lighter stitch count, not as much stitching, just more sketchy, then a good tearaway will work for you. A lot of times there are heavyweight stabilizers, but I have a tendency just to use more than one layer of a tearaway if I feel like I need that. So I think a lot of us like the tearaway just for the convenience of being able to pull it away. And one thing you want to be careful about when you are removing the stabilizer from the back of your project, you don't want to get into all those little small areas on the back. So for example, this one, I don't have any stabilizer. I'm going to talk about towels in a minute. But in this area here, and especially like in here, I would not try to pull that away. I tend to leave stabilizer in some of the smaller areas, and if it comes out later. But it just helps keep your stitches stable. That's the whole reason for it. So, so for just a woven fabric or and that doesn't have very much nap, a cutaway stabilizer or a tearaway stabilizer is going to work pretty well. I like to use for quilts, if I'm doing an embroidery design, a quilt block that I'm going to later add to a quilt, I like to use this soft tearaway because whatever you leave in there feels a little bit more like cloth and isn't going to feel papery and isn't going to make your quilt feel quite as stiff. So that's what I generally use a tearaway for, is for things that woven fabrics that don't have a really high stitch count. One thing that people often want to do when they start machine embroidery, one of the main reasons they do machine embroidery is they want to personalize things and gifts. So things like monograms, putting your names on, and towels as a wedding gifts or anniversary gifts, that kind of thing is something that people often want to be able to do. So I brought an example of a towel that I've done, and I like to use for towels a washaway stabilizer. And this is the kind that I like to use. It's fabric-like, and you can put it in the hoop. And what I do with towels, I'm going to actually show you kind of how I do the hooping. Actually with towels, if I've got some heavy stitching, I will use 2 layers of this on the back and then lay my towel down. And I like to use a magnetic hoop for this because one thing that can happen with towels is you can get, if you put it in a plastic traditional hoop like this one, because you push that hoop down in over the nap of the towel, it can leave something we call hoop burn. So there can actually be an outline of the hoop that it's really hard to get rid of. So I like to use a magnetic hoop for this. I put my 2 layers of water-soluble stabilizer down. Like I said, I just have one there for right now, but it's just for the purpose of illustration. And then for this particular hoop, it's got these magnets that then you put around it. And so you don't have to shove all of that heavy fabric down into a plastic hoop and try to get it to stay closed, which is also sometimes a problem. And then it's just a little bit easier to deal with. And it's also easier to shift things around. If you find out you don't have it hooped just right and you want to move it, it's easier to move. The other thing I do is put a piece of either water soluble. I tend to keep my scraps because usually when you're done with this, with an embroidery, you're going to have some scraps of stabilizer left over. And sometimes I get fairly big scraps left over depending on the size of my hoop. And so with those larger scraps, I hang on to them and I just use them as my topper. So I actually use most of the time this fabric-like wash-away topper to put on top of the towel. And this is really for anything that's got some pile or nap to it. It's good to put a topper on top. What that does is help keep your stitches from sinking down into for example, on the towel, into the loops on your towel, and keep them up above. I also have something else I'm going to show you here in a minute. So there's also a film-like water-soluble stabilizer that you can use. It looks a lot like the one I have in my hand. You can just put that over the top and it tears away part of the way, and then the rest of it you can just kind of damp off. If you put the water-soluble stabilizer, the cloth one on, it takes a little bit more to get it off. But that's what I usually use. And then there's also a heat-away. This is actually a heat-away topper, and you put that down over your design, and when you're done, you can use an iron to get it away. It's not my favorite, but it's a great option for items if you don't want to wash your towels before you give them as gifts, for example. This is a great option for that. Okay, so towels are kind of special, and anything with a nap is kind of special. And so the reason I like to use the water-soluble stabilizer on the back is because when I'm done, I don't want to have stabilizer on the back of my towel here. I like to just have it wash away, and then really all you feel is the embroidery. I also, on the back, use bobbin thread. Instead of embroidery bobbin thread, I use regular thread that matches my towel. And you still do see some of the color coming through from the top, but it's a little bit nicer than just bobbin thread. And then the other thing I like to do is in my software, I've got a couple of different pieces of software that will do this for me. I like to create what's called a nap blocker. And there are stitches down underneath the monogram here that I've stitched in gray that have actually flattened down the towel. So the loops are not coming up in between the letters and in the gaps in the letters. That just is a really great feature if you have software. Find out how to make that happen, because I think it just makes your towels look much nicer. So that's pretty much what I do with towels. With another thing that people really like to stitch on when they get an embroidery machine is t-shirts. And I do something a little different with t-shirts. You could use a tearaway, cutaway, or a washaway, but the washaway is not going to stay in, and you're really, with a stretchy fabric like this, you want to have a stabilizer that's going to stay with your stitches so they don't get distorted after you've washed it and things like that. So I generally stay away from water soluble, although I do use a topper on a t-shirt, or especially a sweatshirt, something that's got a little more loft to it. So what I like to use on the back of my t-shirts is a fusible poly mesh. So this is a Cutaway Stabilizer. It's nice and firm, but it's very lightweight. And the best thing about it is that when you cut it away, you don't see the outline of the stabilizer through your t-shirt. I don't know, I think most of us have probably seen people that have done embroidery on a t-shirt, and you can see the outline of the stabilizer behind the design. So to avoid that, a poly mesh stabilizer is a great way to go. Now, this one's fusible, and the reason I like using a fusible one is that you take your t-shirt and turn it inside out, and wherever you're going to stitch, you need to have it already marked, or at least I usually mark where I'm going to have my design stitch out, so that I can make sure that I'm putting the stabilizer in the right place. And then you want to cut a piece of stabilizer that's big enough for the hoop that you're going to be using. This is just about right for that hoop. And you want to fuse that, take it over to the ironing board, slip your t-shirt over the ironing board, and then you put the shiny side. There's a side that's a little bit shiny and a side that's not. The little bit shiny side is the side that goes next to your t-shirt. And you lay it down on your shirt wherever you're going to stitch. And often I even have it sticking out over the neckline. I don't fuse that part down, but then you go ahead with your iron, follow the directions on your package, and fuse it to the back of your t-shirt. And this is a temporary fusible, so it's not going to stay fused forever. When you're done stitching, you can actually pull it up away from the t-shirt and then cut around it. So it's designed for this particular use. The nice thing about using the fusible is then when you are going to hoop this shirt, or whatever it is you're going to be hooping, you don't have to worry about the stabilizer and the shirt moving in different directions and moving around. It keeps everything together, and it's a lot easier to hoop. The other tip that I learned from Eileen Roach of Dime is that if you do this, after you've fused it, if you turn your t-shirt right side out again and put it over the end of your ironing board, it's a lot easier to hoop it. And I've been using, mentioning Dime, or Designs in Machine Embroidery, I'm using a hoop mat that is a relatively new product from them. It's a silicone mat, and it's really floppy. You don't want to ever cut it. This is not a cutting mat. It's designed to keep your hoop from moving while you try to hoop something. And you can line up your center lines on it, and kind of just helps you keep an idea of where you want to put everything. So it's a really wonderful piece to use. And I actually drape this over my ironing board and then pull my t-shirt on to the ironing board so that the back is hanging down underneath. It just makes it a whole lot easier to avoid getting the back of your t-shirt hooped in with the rest of with the front. So that's what I use almost invariably for t-shirts. And if I don't have the fusible, then I use an adhesive, temporary adhesive spray so that I don't have to deal, especially with t-shirts, with things moving around. And if I do have some really dense stitching, sometimes I'll even use a second layer of this poly mesh, but I don't very often find that it's necessary to do it. It's a really nice, stable fabric there. Okay, so we've talked about water soluble, and we've talked about heat away, and we've talked about fusible poly mesh. These are all the ones that I use the most. Another one that I really like to use, since we're talking about t-shirts, there are some new fabrics out there called, sometimes you'll hear them referred to as performance fabrics or water or moisture wicking fabrics or that kind of thing. They're special fabrics that are designed to help people who work in them or do athletics in them to not sweat as much, or their clothing doesn't get as wet, that kind of thing. So that fabric is it's a knit usually, and it's a little more dense than a regular t-shirt fabric. And so a different stabilizer is kind of necessary for it. And this one is called, the brand that makes this calls it Polypro Performance Stabilizer. And it's got holes in it that make it a little bit more permeable too. And it works really well on those specialty fabrics and keeps them from gathering up when you stitch on them. Also, just another tip for that type of fabric, I use a Microtex needle. Regular needles, I find, have a hard time going through that fabric sometimes. So those are my 2 tips for working with that kind of fabric. Okay, and another one that I really like is a sticky stabilizer. This particular one is a sticky tearaway. There's also a sticky wash away available. And I like to use this for things that are difficult to hoop. And so often I will go ahead and put it in a regular hoop, or sometimes I use my magnetic hoop for this. I'll just show you what it looks like with a regular hoop. It's got a waxy paper on top, and underneath that is the sticky part. And then on the back is either your water soluble or your tearaway. And like I said, this is a tearaway stabilizer. So you put that down on your hoop and just hoop it. And I do this for things that are difficult to hoop. I just hoop the stabilizer, not the item, with this. And you can see my mat's not letting me move that around too easily, which is the whole point, makes it a little easier to do this. Okay, so once you get it in there, then you take, I tend to use my seam ripper for this, and you want to score the fabric, score the waxy paper on top. I just do an X across it, whoops. And you don't want to go too deep, of course, because you don't want to cut holes in the stabilizer itself. But then I also use my seam ripper to pull up the corners of this, pull that paper back and rip it away. And then what you're left with is a sticky piece of stabilizer. You don't have to spray. I use temporary adhesive sprays as little as I can get away with using them, because they can make such a mess. So I really prefer to use the sticky stabilizer if I need to for things. And things that I would use this for, maybe things that are too small to hoop, or ribbon, if you want to do some embroidery on a piece of ribbon, or like a napkin corner, and you want to make sure you get the corner in the right place. This is just an unfinished piece of fabric here, linen here, but what you can do is just take your fabric, place the item where you want it to be, and then you stick it down. And that sticky stabilizer holds it really well. And so there's really not any need for any more stabilization. Although if your machine does a basting stitch, sometimes I will do that, do a basting stitch around the design, and then it just holds it even a little bit better. And then when you're done, you take this out, you pull your Tearaway Stabilizer off, or you wash out your water soluble, and it's that easy to hoop something like this. It's a corner or something like that that's a little bit more difficult. So those are really my basics that I keep around the house all the time and I use on a regular basis. Thanks very much for joining us, and happy sewing.